Holdens and their visit to the Ottoman Empire has already been noted by theatre historians. My research on the subject was initiated by two motives in 2018. First, it was aimed at a detailed investigation into the repertoire and iconography of Turkish puppetry for a broader perspective to understand its transformations in the late 19th century. Secondly, I was intrigued by a newspaper article mentioned in early publications. According to this article, the puppets of Cinderella and the clown got missing prior to Holden's departure from Istanbul. The author of the article came up with an anecdote suggesting that a photographer fell in love with Cinderella and abducted her. As McCormick suggests, this may be a little more than a puff designed to suggest the lifelike qualities of the marionettes. But I thought that it could work perfectly for a scenario to write a new Karayüz play. For both reasons, I had to see the original sources myself, so my first research was on newspapers in which the programs of the shadows were published. On December 22, 1891, a review in the newspaper called Istanbul, which was a newspaper published in French in Istanbul at that time, describes one of the earliest performances by Thomas Holden in Istanbul as follows. There couldn't be a more seasonable and amusing entertainment than that which is now being given in the kiosk of Petit Champ Municipal Garden, Pera. Mr. Holden presents us what is the nearest approach to an imitation of human life on stage that we have never seen. How this is accomplished is Mr. Holden's mystery. It is a Drury Lane pantomime in miniature, and the greatest treat that could be offered to anyone in Constantinople. The proscenium is brilliant and the scenery highly artistic. All through the performance last Tuesday, the spectators alternated loud applause with bursts of laughter, and at its conclusion, Mr. Holden was thrice recalled, the whole of the spectators rising and shouting bravo. Thomas Holden and his company stayed in Istanbul for almost 4 months, and one of the detailed programs, as we see here, there are 3 programs, but they're almost the same, published in the same newspaper, demonstrates what was meant by the definition, a Drury Lane pantomime in miniature. This program shows that the Holdens successfully blended the repertoire of the Victorian stage and the popular theatrical entertainment, and they generously brought their interpretation to Istanbul. The main part of their show was a fairy tale and commedia dell'arte inspired pantomime, Cinderella, enriched by sideshows, acrobats, circus acts, transformation scenes, optical entertainment, various spectacle, music, all performed by life-size marionettes, manipulated by advanced mechanics. Thomas Holden came back in 1884 with a similar program, and in 1890 it was his brother James Holden who continued the legacy until the first decade of the 20th century. So in short, the monarchs of the marionette theatre, as McCormick defines them, performed in Turkey through 30 years with long breaks. Eyewitnesses who watched the Holdens at a young age were amazed by the same features as the European audience, who experienced the so-called Holdenomania. Sermet Muhtar Ali summarizes what he remembers about what he saw on these Frank puppeteers, and his record follows the order of a regular Holden performance. I quote, "One Ramazan, they rented one of the shabby theaters in Direkler Arası, and it was full of customers every night. The screen they used was as big as the wide screens of today's cinemas. The puppets were around 1 meter tall, and there were dozens of them. The scenery was meticulous, eye-catching, and varied. The tricks they made had never been seen before and would never be seen again. Pantomimes of Pierrot, Columbine, Harlequin, a wonderful comedy with all sorts of characters, acrobats, juggling, ballerinas, elegant belly dancers, skulls and skeletons. I can never forget the scenes which portrayed heaven-like green fields and glittering river, angels flying, mountains behind them, among which colorful and lightful waterfalls appeared. However, we know that Holdens were not the only visiting puppeteers. Official documents and permissions regulations in the state archives provide names and content regarding other European professionals who also performed in Istanbul. Their visits coincided with one of those periods in which masters of puppetry questioned the worth and the future of their profession. In fact, the literary figures of the second half of the 19th century had already started discussions over the Westernization period and its effects on Turkish theatre, and Karagöz was one of their favorite subjects. Would a decent national theatre in Western lines be constructed on traditional forms? Or could Karagöz be upgraded to the new understanding of theatre? Interviews conducted in the early years of the Republican era demonstrate that the puppeteers, especially those among a certain age, share similar ideas. To them, the new generation, the new audience, was not interested in their art anymore due to the new forms of entertainment like cinema. They believed that the old-style puppetry is dead because people did not appreciate their efforts enough, and they couldn't maintain the fundamentals of their traditions because they didn't get enough support. However, some puppeteers rejected the idea of a downfall. They believed that the audience demanded new plays with new, proper theatre texts adapted to the puppet stage with a rich variety of side shows. In fact, some of them claimed that they succeeded in doing so, and so that the intervention of European puppetry played a significant role in their adaptations. When Thomas Holden finalized his first tour in Istanbul, his fame had already spread. He left behind secrets and mysteries to be solved. A review published in the same newspaper claimed that, I quote, "It would be difficult to imagine any representation that could compete with these Holden puppets in art, amusement, and innocence. No one has had the privilege of going backstage to see how these dolls were operated, and everyone is intrigued to know just how big they are. We regret that we cannot satisfy public curiosity on this point. Mr. Holden forbid even representatives of the press to go behind the curtain." But just after a decade, probably after James Holden's performances, Turkish puppeteers such as Emin Bey, Cemil Mehmet Bey, and Halim Bey were performing Holden's repertory with Holden-genre puppets in various parts of Istanbul. In the same newspaper, in 1896, we see the program offered by Emin Bey, and it can be noted that even the titles of each show remained the same. But also, instead of Cinderella, his main story was The Beauty and the Beast, which is another famous pantomime of the period. So the abduction of Cinderella could have been fake news circulated for the sake of publicity. But it is told that Halim Bey sneaked into Holden's backstage at nights, took the marionettes to a workshop, and successfully imitated each curious and exciting detail of the Holden marionettes. For instance, he was so good at the dance of the skeletons that while he was performing for Abdülhamid II, his daughter Naime Sultan was so scared that she got sick and Halim had to leave the country for a while. The impact of technologies and techniques popularized by the Holdens and other European puppeteers continued until 1950s, and its traces can still be observed in today's puppetry. As more Turkish puppeteers got involved into novelties, borders between forms, materials, and the text got vague. Puppeteers blended wonders of the Frank marionettes with kukla ballet, which they called it, with Turkish scenarios and characters, and some of them were also inspired by European examples. In 1934, Hikmet Feridun S. visited Saadettin Bey in his workshop and watched a performance by him, which started with the presentation of a dramatic piece, followed by the adventures of Elish, a form of hand puppetry, flying in a balloon in front of a magical scenery. And after his unfortunate death, trick and transformation marionettes like the disintegrating skeleton and the Grand Turk enters. Here in these pictures, we see on the left-hand side the juggler marionette, dissecting skeleton, but of course, I should note that these are not Holden marionettes, these are the Tiller family collection. And on the right-hand side, we see the skeletons and the Cadde marionettes by Saadettin Bey and Fuat Kuşoğlu in the first half of the 20th century. Also, when we look at the publicities, on the left-hand side we see Thomas Holden's publicity print poster in the 19th century, and on the right-hand side we see Mazhar Baba, the first half of the 20th century. So the way he introduces himself, just like Holden, surrounded by his puppets, and Mazhar Baba advertising saying elektrikli asri kukla, meaning electrical modern puppets. But was it only the marionettes, string puppets, or hand puppets which were influenced by the European examples? The old classical repertoire of Karagöz plays show that the concept of play within play, as well as music, had already been used regularly as a comic formula or as a motif or interlude, just like in the play called Jambaz, the Acrobats. Some of these puppets which you see on the right-hand side date back to the 18th century, so before the visiting European companies. But the circus as a theme was very popular because acrobats, tightrope walkers were kind of traditional performance during the Ottoman Empire. So these puppets were used in a scenario based on traditional stories about tightrope walkers. But when we look at them, it could be observed in the iconographical terms that their models, their design changed, adopting new stories of new acrobats coming from Europe as performers or as puppets. So, on the other hand, Karagöz puppets, which has been used by Karagöz masters, although they are not mentioned in any of the extant written scripts of the classical repertoire, demonstrate how the lifelike marionettes, human-sized marionettes, will be transferred into the two-dimensional world of Karagöz. The puppets we see here on the left side is one of the examples of this Chinese ballet performances, Chinese theme shows in the 19th century European puppetry. And on the right-hand side, we do not know exactly which plays these were used, because it could be used in any play as a variety section, interlude. We see Chinese ballet by Ragıp Tultekin in the early 20th century. So these two examples were actually drew my attention for the first time about the connections. Also, as a last example, is for trick and transformation puppets. This is a different example because it resembles one of the stereotype characters called Frank, the European citizen or the visitor to the Ottoman Empire. But also we see him as a transformation puppet, probably used in the acrobatic themed plays. But like I said, it could be used in any of the plays as an interlude, but it's a kind of blend between the classical repertoire and also the new coming, the European one. So, to conclude, I'm not finished yet. Trebek and Katriski suggest that performance genres functioned as instruments of mobility, exchange and connection prior to the popularization of printed world. So similarly, the transnational connections which contributed to the formation of Turkish theatre and performing arts were enabled by several dynamics such as imperial ceremonies, traveling troupes and independent performance before the advent of printing press or the pioneering adaptations of Western dramatic theatre. Investigating the impact of Holden's on Turkish puppetry draws our attention not just to the consequences of passing geographical borders, but also how local puppeteers reorganized their own artistic borders by adopting new and challenging models of performances. What is more, as transcultural mediators, pole dance drew our attention to the limitations of conventional historiography, which categorizes the theatrical events of the 19th century as the theater of westernization or Western-style theater, because what here is meant by westernization is often the introduction of legitimate theater and dramatic literature performed in classical idea of theater. However, it was not only the legitimate forms of theater imported from the West. In fact, the first theater buildings which hosted Western modern theater and performing arts, which monopolized staging of legit plays, were constructed to perform as circuses, not legit theaters. Before the 19th century, famous acrobats, tightrope walkers from the Ottoman Empire had been invited to European festivals, and likewise in the 19th century European troops were in demand, so they were popular in Istanbul. For instance, just before the declaration of the Imperial Edict of Reorganization in 1839, Mahmud II watched the French equestrian Louis Solier, sorry for my pronunciation, during a tour in the Balkans and requested him to prepare a spectacular ceremony for his daughter's wedding. The Gelin Pasha Theatre, which later hosted the Ottoman Theatre Company, was built as a circus for the first time. So likewise, puppetry worked as a platform for the transfer and interplay of different cultural practices across borders. And as for my interpretation of this change and transaction, this is how I interpreted what Holden's Cinderella and the skeleton would look like on Karagöz stage. Thank you.